So there are loads of issues. Sexuality and gender is one of the most controversial topics. So one thing you shouldn't be telling your students is this is what happened in ancient history, because the arguments are so fierce about things which you think must be quite straightforward. We're still arguing. The question why this should be so controversial is an interesting one in itself. But one of the reasons why it's so controversial is because it matters to us so much. So it's something which people really have a very large, modern, contemporary vested interest in. So the reason it's controversial is also the reason why it's interesting and important and relevant, I think. That's one way around it. Also, it's a difficult subject in itself because we're talking about, very subtle, invisible things. So how can we know anything about love in, when we talk about Sappho 600 before Christ, how can we possibly say anything about that? Could you say something about love in England in 600 BC? Well, how do we know these things? And so one of the key things, which I think is really important, is to remember that we know these things because they have been not just relics, like a secret diary which has been discovered, like the diary of Anne Lister, for instance. These are monuments. These are things which have been pushed out there, which have been inscribed in stone in some cases, or sung. They've been reproduced over hundreds, over thousands of years. So these are not secret little documents about private lives. I will go quickly through. These are my slides. Here's a nice one of the reception of Sappho. Sappho was reconceived in the 19th century as a kind of lovelorn woman. And there's, of course, lots of dispute about her sexuality in the 19th century, colliding with hostility to homosexuality. One thing which I think is important is that ancient writers, ancient male writers, loved Sappho. So this idea that she, it's a kind of abandoned minority voice in the ancient world is not true. She was celebrated in her own time. She was called the 10th Muse. She was, this is one of my favorites. This is a geographer, Strabo, a geographer of the Augustan period. But he has this fabulous phrase, passing, just as he's passing over the subject of Sappho, thaumastonti crema, a wonderful thing. She's just a marvelous, it could be like a miraculous thing, how can a woman do this? But the basic sense is just a marvelous, wonderful thing. So Sappho is really important, celebrated throughout from the classical period onwards. Another issue which comes up a lot with my students and elsewhere is this whole thing about, all we have from antiquity is the male elite perspective. And therefore, when you get Sappho, it's like, oh my God, we've got a woman speaking, So let's listen really carefully. What does she, she's speaking for the whole of the women of the ancient Greek world. So everything she says must be womanly. Must be the woman's perspective on everything. And of course, she cannot possibly stand up to that kind of pressure, that kind of burden which we place on her. She doesn't have she doesn't have this perspective which is on everything. Speaking for the entirety of her sex for 700 years. Well, that might be true. It might not be true. See if you can find a woman's perspective in Sappho. What else? What do we know about the world? Almost nothing. Really, really nothing. Archaeologically, we have almost nothing from Lesbos of her time, whether she's from Mytilene or Erissos or wherever. All the stuff we get is from contemporary poets. What that reveals is that these are aristocratic societies, very, very interested in their own wonderfulness. There's a lot of resentment of nouveau riche or vulgar people coming up, a lot of kind of Asian-flavored, Lydian-flavored luxury and sophistication, lots of money. Also, there is fierce competition. There are kind of endless wars between rival factions. This is what we get above all from Sappho's fellow lesbian Caius. Here is Caius. Caius was said to have driven away many of the people of Lesbos from the viciousness of his poetry. So he also writes same-sex love poetry, but a lot of what survives is political, highly political, and very nasty. He's ancient modern readers sometimes thought there must be two Caiuses. There must be one who writes the nasty faction poetry and one who writes the supposed love poetry, of which there's very little, just what we hear about from Cicero and others. So this is the context, and what a lot of people have argued with regard to Caius, how we balance these two things, is that it's like, okay, if you're my enemy, I will write these nasty poets, but there's also a political side to his same-sex love poetry, which is, you can be part of my team, you can be part of my gang, so that there's a political element to his same-sex love poetry, which is also political. And so people have wondered, and I think there's some good evidence for this, if Sappho's same-sex love poetry is also about politics, building alliances, flattering people, bringing them into the political group on behalf of her brothers, for instance. So here is Sappho, again a vase 480, showing how famous she is. We do have some examples of what seem to be examples of Greek men on pots speaking Sappho, singing Sappho. So you've got a man at a Greek symposium who's pretending to be a woman in love with women. And it's really extraordinary. I mean, this is, one of my friends was saying, why are there so many women in Greek tragedy? And I say, it's not just that there are women in Greek tragedy, it's that there are men, there are Greek men who want to play women in Greek tragedy. There's this whole thing about gender, taking on a different gender, is really quite normal in ancient Greek society, ancient Athenian society. So they don't mind saying, Sappho refers to herself. She refers to herself as a feminine. She refers to herself as Sappho. So a Greek man is saying, I, Sappho. So when you read these poems, think about a man singing this in a symposium. Okay, choruses. There are lots of choruses of young people in the ancient world. These are the most important thing in the tragic performances. We always think of the plays, we always think of Aeschylus and Euripides, but the competition, really, the most important competition was for the boys and the men's cyclic dances, the kukloi, the circles of dances. That's what if your tribe was competing and you won one of those, that was what you set up your podium for, your trophy. That was your tribal victory. And there's lots and lots of evidence that young women also danced in these circular choruses, usually at night, it seems. So a lot of people have said, well, this must be the context for these songs. Literary context is easier than any other kind of context. Lyric poetry. Nowadays, we often set up a kind of historical development. It starts with epic, Homer, Hesiod, in these big, long, heavy hexameters. Da, 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 da. Same line every time, going on and on and on, in this unique dialect, which is a kind of Homeric dialect. It's a bit Ionic. It's got some other elements. It's an artificial, universal dialect. Everybody knows epic dialect. And then you have this lyric poetry, so lyric from lyre, yes? So these are solipsistic songs sung to the lyre. And what's very interesting is that these use your local accent. your local dialect of Greek, which can be very different. And Sappho and Caius use a very strong lesbian accent. So it says, this is from here. And it's not, it's something which you would have to pick up from other people. You'd have to work out how am I going to make sense of this weird song. When you're singing, I am Sappho. Of course, you don't say Sappho because that's not how her name is pronounced in lesbian dialect. It's Sappho. Instead of roses, they say broses. So there's a different accent, and it's very individual, very particular. So you've got universal epic, and you've got this very private, individual, local lyre song. And that goes with a very solipsistic voice, a voice which talks about the interior, what's happening inside. So on the one hand, epic battles, on the other hand, this interior voice. Some people have said, okay, but even in Homer, you have Achilles playing the lyre by himself. So the idea that there's a development or there's an opposition here. They must always have been contemporary with each other. It's just that through survivals, epic starts out. The survivals from epic are probably from the late 8th century, and the early survivals of the private solipsistic lyric poetry are much later. But perhaps, probably, they were contemporaries, and it's just a matter of survival that we get that sense of development. But definitely in Sappho, you can see that opposition. You can see that contextualization, if you like. Whoops. Okay, so all the lyric poets had a rough time. What we think now is that Sappho did very well until the 10th century. And some point in the 10th century, she stopped being copied by Byzantine librarians. So an awful lot of what we have comes from papyri, again, showing how popular she was at that point, or quotations. And one of the wonderful things about Sappho is that she keeps popping up, yes? We keep getting new fragments of Sappho on, I think nowadays it's more often to be on cartonnage, on the paper which is used to wrap mummies. Those are where the most recent have come. So it's quite an exciting time. We have much more Sappho than they had in the 19th century or earlier, a lot more. And there's potential for much more to come. Yes, okay, an early potsherd. It's not just fragments of papyrus, it's also written on clay. And one thing I think is interesting, and this is something which I don't know if you talk about this with your students, is the whole idea of Sappho as a lesbian in particular, in the modern sense of the term. We do have some evidence that there are these what are called syzygies, which is the same word as is used in the Greek Bible and in Greek generally for marriage, joining people together. What God has joined, let no man put asunder. The word there is yoke together, conjugal. And Sappho occasionally we find this word syndigos. So I think, this is kind of really obscure. This is not mainstream at all, but some really mainstream scholars have concluded, as I concluded, that there must have been some kind of institutional relationships. One nice response to that, possibly, is from another lyric poet, Anacreon, from around, when's Anacreon? Around 520, up to 520, 540 to 520, something like that. And he talks about playing a game, gold-haired love, tossing in my direction a scarlet ball, sends me an invitation to play games with the girl with the fancy footwear. But she says she doesn't like my hair because it's white, or because she is from beautifully colonized Lesbos and is gagging for another of her sex. That seems to be an ancient example of someone recognizing that women from Lesbos like other women. So this is going counter to a lot of the stuff about sexuality, sexual orientation as a modern construct that doesn't apply to the ancient world. Okay, I think there are lots of good reasons why you might think that, but there are also these hints every now and again of something which is very different. Why is that? Is that because they think all women in Lesbos are homosexual, or is it because there's a kind of institutionalized set of relationships in Lesbos which is visible from other places, and therefore they can make a joke about that? Here's another example. We'll find this interesting name, Magilla. This is one of the most straightforward examples from Lucian. So it's a very late source, around 220 AD. Is that right? I can't remember when Lucian was again now. So 3rd century AD. But here you have, in this dialogue of the courtesans, they say in Lesbos there are women with a male countenance who don't like undergoing it at the hands of men, but get off by cozying up to, often that just means having sex with, plesiadzousas, to women in the way men do. And it happens that the woman that she's been got into this lesbian threesome with turns out to be from, one is from Corinth and the other one is from Lesbos. She's called Magilla, the rich lesbian woman. It's very funny. It's a very comical dialogue. And here, this is the climax of her little story. At first they kissed me like men. In time, Magilla removed her wig, which was very realistic and close-fitting, and revealed a skinhead. Have you ever seen so beautiful a young man, she said. And I said, I don't see a young man here, Magilla. Don't put me in the feminine gender, she says. I am called Magillas, and I've been married to Demonassa here for donkey's years, and she is my wife. I was born a woman like the rest of you women, but my mind and desire and everything else is that of a man. Give me a chance, Aina, if you don't believe me, and you'll come to recognize that I lack nothing of what men have. And this is where she draws a veil, finally. Don't ask for details. They are iskra, ugly, shameful things. In the name of heavenly Aphrodite, I won't tell. Heavenly Aphrodite, interesting reference that. Shall we have a quick look at our handout now? Is this going to work? What do I need to do? Okay, first one. Well, I put my clean copy. This was the only bit of Sappho for a long time, or almost the only bit of Sappho for a long time. A wonderful poem. Have you all had a look at this with your students? It's just amazing, isn't it? What can I tell you that you don't already know? It's quite, although it's in a lesbian accent, in a lesbian dialect, it's quite simple in terms of syntax. It's quite straightforward. I wouldn't say that Sappho is casual, but it's not so highfalutin as a lot of the other lyric poets. It's quite simple to understand. What is nice about it, I think, is this strong sense of a vision that gradually comes closer and closer. Putting her, first of all, in indirect speech, and then suddenly she's speaking to her directly and addressing her by name. You know, and you said, so this is Aphrodite herself speaking her own words. Who is now abusing you, Sappho? I think that's just an amazing kind of vivid, very unusual kind of presence, present vision. And then, of course, the vision disappears, and she goes, if ever, remember that this is in the past. So it comes clearer and clearer, and then it disappears again. This one here, I'm sure you have lots of other things to say about that. This one here is the one that people often say, this is the woman's perspective. Okay? And here we've got the epic. So is it epic versus lyric, or is this a man versus a woman? That because Sappho is a woman, she looks at the whole story of Troy in a different way. She doesn't want all this stuff about armies. So it's identifying the female, the feminine, with the personal, the introspective. I think it's very obvious that this is, some people say, the fairest thing to see, the best thing to look at. We think that's a reference to the way that poets are said to put visions in front of your eyes. Some people say that Homer, the subject of Homer, is the best thing to hear. I think it's much more whatever one loves. Is that a female perspective or not? In here, yes, her relationship with her family. Quite subversive, I think, isn't it? It's quite I mean, is this part of her humour? There's definitely a sense that she's maybe undermining the whole epic mentality, trivializing it, or celebrating small things. And then she returns to that. I would rather see her lovely step and the radiant sparkle of her face. Something so trivial and minor. Yes, compared with all the war chariots in Lydia and soldiers battling in shining bronze. But the lyric poets generally do this thing of undermining epic. Caius famously writes a song about throwing his shield away, leaving his shield behind, which people thought was really shocking. How could you write about that? So is it gender or is it genre? One of the most famous poems. This one has been spoken of a lot. It's really remarkable the way that it's like a short story. How do we imagine this scenario unfolding? Where do we imagine we're sitting? First of all, to me, it seems that man has the fortune of the gods. It looks like she's saying how wonderful that man is. And then it's reversed because he's talking to you. So we're ricocheting around. She's looking at him. He's looking at her, this wonderful woman. And then this whole interior dialogue, what's happening to her. She can't speak. So how can she be singing all these things if she can't speak? So this is a nice enactment of interiority, a joke, if you like. I can't see, but here I'm telling you exactly what's happening through me. I'm telling you I'm speechless. And also there's a nice parallel here in the Greek. It seems, he seems, I seem. Notoriously, this poem was used by the so-called ethno-psychoanalyst Georges Devers, who wrote an article for the Classical Quarterly saying this proves that Sappho was a proper psychopathic lesbian, because it was obvious that she was suffering physically because of her neurosis, which derived from her want of a phallus, basically, according to him. So this one has been used as proof that there was sexual orientation in the ancient world through neurosis, because it shows that she was suffering she was having a panic attack, basically. No one really believes that anymore, I think it's safe to say. Now then, and one of the new Sappho poems, this is the translation by Martin West. I'm sure do you all use these new poems as well? Are they on your list? This one, where she talks of old age. Now then, and there's a new one, there's a new poem which seems to refer to her brothers as well, isn't there, which I have not put on here yet. What's interesting is that there is a large biographical tradition about Sappho. And a lot of people have ignored that completely. But it's clear that she wrote about herself, she wrote about her brothers, and therefore what we get in the biographical tradition is probably, maybe not entirely, but a large part of it is readings or misreadings of references in her own poetry. So one thing we get is that Sappho was dark and ugly. So when it says, my hair's turned white instead of dark, do they just get this little reference here that she's dark? And they think, we'll put that in the biographical tradition. The ancient biographical tradition is really crude and clumsy. So we can find in the biographies of Euripides, there are references to the way that he's portrayed by Aristophanes, for instance. So they see something, you see Euripides and Aristophanes, and they say, this must be what happened in Euripides' life. So they are clueless, clumsy, but they very often do have a text that they're building their ridiculous stories on. So it's possible that some of the stuff which we get down from Sappho is a misreading of references that she has put there herself. I've only got 5 minutes left, is that right? Shall I quickly talk about Plato? Is there any? Yes, okay. Plato is really complicated. Really, really, really complicated. Because he's writing dialogues. So, oh dear, have I made some fearful mistake now, which is... So I think when we saw that you had to do, Plato's views on love and friendship, I thought, oh gosh, who did that? What a nightmare. Very, very difficult to pin him down in anything. So I thought maybe I'd show you how unpinnable down he is. What have I just done? Okay, quickly as I can. Okay, the Symposium is very important. The Symposium is a recollection of a recollection, yes? So there's the several layers of distance that Plato puts between him and what happens, even before you come to the fact that lots of different people are speaking. So when you say Plato says in the Symposium, what on earth does that mean? Plato says that someone says that Aristophanes once said. That is deliberate and self-conscious, so definitely not everything that everybody says in the Symposium is Plato's view on anything. That is just impossible. Now, you might say, well, what Socrates says represents Plato's view, and that might be true, but even that is not necessarily true. Phaedra. So I always wonder what's going on here. How is Phaedrus being characterized by Phaedrus' speech? So Phaedrus is all about nobility, self-sacrifice, the army of lovers. Very interesting. What I like is that he has a little criticism of Aeschylus. He says Aeschylus talks nonsense by making Achilles the Erastes, the admirer of Patroclus, because he's young, so Achilles must be the Eromenos. He must be the admired. So that's quite interesting for the distinction roles and how, in a way, that doesn't really make much difference. Oh, yes, the other important thing is Xenophon quotes. So again, we talk about the biographical tradition, how people don't really, how ancient writers kind of misunderstand literature in a really, really weird way. And one fabulous example of that is a contemporary of Plato, Xenophon, writes his own Symposium, pretends it's what really happened. There was someone called Pausanias who said this, which I suppose is what Plato is implying. Yes, these are real people, and he's saying this is what they said. And then he gets the names wrong. He gets the names mixed up. He gets Pausanias' speech and Phaedrus' speech mixed up. So it's a really good example for the reception of Plato's Symposium by a contemporary being misunderstood. First of all, being taken as literal, and secondly, by being got wrong. Pausanias' speech is probably the most important text for the study of Greek homosexuality. Heavenly End, Pandemos, Aphrodite, these are real cults, but not in the way that Plato says. There really is an Aphrodite Urania. It's not about lustlessness. It's about universal Aphrodite, normally connected with ancient Eastern goddesses. Aphrodite Pandemos is the Aphrodite worshipped by the state, the people's Aphrodite. She's not vulgar, lustful, it's just of the state. Aphrodite is very often connected with magistrates. She's a political divinity. And then he talks about varieties of Greek homosexuality. My favorite bit here is, and this is the one that my students always embrace, or I try